We fell for it again. The White House said a deal to end the war in Iran was close, markets rallied, Republicans celebrated, but the U.S. is still waiting for Iran to respond as I'm talking here, and it's not looking great. It also turns out that the deal the White House is offering is essentially the same one that Trump ripped up in 2018. And maybe the biggest stunner yet, the Secretary of State just straight up told everyone the White House doesn't care about the law when it comes to Iran. But at least one member of Congress, a Republican no less, is trying to make them. It's Thursday, May 7th, 2026. I'm Grant Hermes, and this is Make It Make Sense. All right, before we get rolling today, this is a shorter episode. I am not feeling super hot today, and I don't want to subject you to that more than I have to, so let's just dive right in. Earlier this week, we talked about how the Trump administration had declared the war in Iran over, except it's not really over. The president told Congress and the Senate that the war, under the name Operation Epic Fury, was terminated, and they were moving on to a humanitarian peacekeeping mission called Project Freedom. That was meant to help ships navigate their way through the Strait of Hormuz, which is filled with mines right now. And as we're talking, just 7 ships have made it through in the last 24 hours. Project Freedom was barely 24 hours old when on Tuesday, another Tuesday in which the president did an about-face, not beating the Trump always chickens out or taco allegations here, he announced that Project Freedom was ending all of a sudden, but the U.S. blockade would still be there. Now, according to NBC News, the reason the president backed off the plan really before it got off the ground was because Saudi Arabia suspended the U.S. from using its air bases and airspace to run the operation. Why? Because Trump didn't ask. According to diplomats who spoke to NBC, the White House didn't clear the plan with our Middle Eastern allies who were upset that Trump has been looking for a way to walk away from a war as his poll numbers at home sink and gas prices rise. But it's these Persian Gulf Coast countries who are the ones that are at risk from Iranian missiles and drone strikes, and they've been getting hit pretty hard since this war started. So to all of a sudden have the U.S. looking for a way out without telling our friends, yeah, it made them mad. Now, it looks as if this afternoon some of those bases are back open for military use, but who knows what will happen next with the Strait. So the administration shuts down Project Freedom, but leaves the blockade of the Strait in place, which leaves kind of the same question I asked on Tuesday. Is this a war or not? It certainly feels like Trump is in charge of one, and we are definitely still paying for it. But remember that the law that the president was using, the War Powers Act or War Powers Resolution Act, expired last week. But we're still running something in the Gulf, so what now? On Wednesday morning, Trump promised more bombings in Iran if peace talks didn't work out. He posted on Truth Social saying, assuming Iran agrees to give what has been agreed to, which is perhaps a big assumption, the already legendary Epic Fury will be at an end. If they don't agree, the bombing starts, and it will be, sadly, at a much higher level and intensity than it was before. Moving on from the first part, because no one knows what's been agreed to by either side here, Trump has made those boasts before, and they've turned out to be complete lies. There's just no way to know if he's telling the truth when it comes to what has or hasn't been agreed to. The second part there, though, is Trump saying actually the operation he told Congress on legal header was over isn't over. It's also unclear what we'd be targeting in more intense bombings because the positions of the White House and the Pentagon are that there's nothing left to bomb except civilian targets like bridges and power plants. More on that a little later. And even then, because Trump, like I said, formally told Congress the war was over, there would be no legal authority for him to carry out the same operation that he said was over. And if your head is spinning a little bit right now, mine was too. It's why I reached out to Yale law professor Una Hathaway for some help, and this is what she said. What they call it doesn't really mean anything. The truth is that the hostilities have not ceased in any real sense, and the war has clearly passed beyond the 60-day limit in the War Powers Resolution. Playing games with names doesn't change that. So a war by any other name drops just as many bombs. And then just a few hours later, Secretary of State Marco Rubio told essentially the world during the White House press briefing, you know what, the White House isn't really going to follow the law anyway.
The War Powers Act is unconstitutional, 100%. Now, this is not the position of me, not the position of the President of the United States now. This is the position of every single president that has occupied this position since the day that law passed. It's completely unconstitutional. Now, we comply with it in terms of like notification because we want to preserve good relations with Congress, right? And we do that. But even as a senator, I would say that the War Powers Act is 100% unconstitutional. And look, I know some of you, whatever you want to say, but this is not this president's position. That has been the position of every single presidential administration since the day that law passes. An infringement on the president's constitutional powers. We don't acknowledge the law as constitutional. Nonetheless, we comply with elements of it for purposes of maintaining, good relations with Congress. And we want them to be involved and we want them to be informed.
Real quick, it's Marco Rubio as press secretary right now because Caroline Leavitt, the actual press secretary, is out on maternity leave. She just had a baby. It's also Rubio's fifth job inside this administration right now, and it'll definitely be a bunch of good video for him when he inevitably runs for president in 2028. Anyway, what you just heard was the country's top diplomat as Secretary of State saying when it comes to the law designed to keep the president's ability to wield the most powerful military humanity has ever seen in check, the White House is only going to follow it so it can stay in the good graces of a bunch of people who have at every turn done exactly what the president wants. It's not exactly like the relationship here has been strained with Congress. But also, more importantly, and not to get two things you forgot from civics class about this, but the executive branch doesn't get to decide which laws it is or isn't going to follow, or which parts of laws it is or isn't going to follow. Rubio is sort of right here. The presidents in the past have said they think the War Powers Act is unconstitutional. Not everyone, but every president has looked to expand their power, and the War Powers Act is a law that stands in the way of expanding presidential power in a big way, which is using the military however they want. I've talked about before how presidents have gotten around needing to ask Congress for permission to use the military, and every time it's been met with pushback, usually bipartisan pushback in some form or fashion. Article 2 of the Constitution does give the president the ability to control how the military is used. That's the commander-in-chief job. But crucially, it's Article 1, and that's later backed up by the War Powers Act, that says while the president gets to say how, it's up to Congress to say whether or if the military can be used because they control the money. That's why the founders of the United States gave Congress the power to declare war, not the president. But Marco Rubio is saying here, nah, you know what? We just don't like that. So we're just going to say it's not a real law and move on. Now, there is a Republican in Congress who is actually saying, hold on a second here. Representative Tom Barrett from Michigan. He's an Iraq War veteran who this week filed a bill that would give the administration authorized use of military force, or an AUMF, to operate in Iran. Retroactively, it started on May 1st, a few days before Trump said operations were terminated. The AUMF would let the war continue for the next 90 days, but really just the blockade in the Strait and maybe some bombings of military targets in Iran, no boots on the ground, no nation building, no occupying Iranian territory. It would last until July 30th, which, if you're keeping track on your at-home war in Iran chart, it would mean the war would have lasted 5 months, a full 16 weeks longer than the president initially promised. And if the Pentagon estimates are right about how long it would take the Strait of Hormuz to get back to normal, about 7 months, we wouldn't see gas prices back to where they were at the beginning of this year, so below $3 a gallon nationally roughly, until next year. Barrett's bill hasn't been taken up yet. It was only filed this morning, and Congress isn't back in session until next Tuesday. But it's an interesting little bit of politics here for a couple reasons. First, it could be a signal from Barrett to a White House that needs a legal lifeline when it comes to the war. That's why the bill gives this backdated power to May 1st. If that's the case, it could be a sign from Barrett that he needs some help from Trump in his district, which is a purple district, and his race is considered a toss-up right now. And that could be bait to other Republicans who are in, let's say, rough waters when they look ahead to the midterms. And they might want to join on to this bill too if it's seen by the White House as a lifeline. On the other hand, it could be seen as an attempt to undermine Trump. a rogue member of the party trying to rein in his power. And if that's the case, then it could be a poisonous bill for a lot of people. We will just have to wait and see what happens next. Now, that 90-day timeline that Barrett wants might just be more important than it looks like on the surface, because we got two new huge pieces of news today, both from a major report in the Washington Post. What it says is that U.S. intelligence officials now believe that Iran could keep the Strait of Hormuz closed for another 3 to 4 months before feeling any real major economic pain. And then there's the second piece of news, which, despite Trump telling reporters that Iran only had 18 or 19% of its missile stockpile left, what U.S. officials told the Washington Post was, quote, Iran retains about 75% of its pre-war inventories of mobile launchers, about 70% of its pre-war stockpiles of missiles, and that there was evidence that the regime had been able to recover and reopen almost all of its underground storage facilities, repair some damaged missiles, and even assemble some new missiles that were nearly complete when the war began. Which actually means Iran might be in a better position right now than the U.S. is. Because according to a report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies from late last month, the U.S. has burned through nearly half of the critical missiles needed to carry out strikes on Iran that have names that you know, like Tomahawk or Patriot missiles. Many of those are the same kinds of missiles that we would need for possible future conflicts, especially if they were with major powers like China or Russia. And it's not like we can get those things made overnight. Amazon doesn't have a prime warehouse we can get them from. It takes months to make these missiles, and companies sometimes need years of contract negotiations and lead time just to agree to make them. And to get back to where we were before the Iran war could take as long as 5 years, depending on the missile we're talking about. Now, could Iran block the strait that long? No. Would oil and gas prices keep climbing, though? Probably. And it would likely break the global economy even before we got anywhere close to the 5-year mark, which is what it seems like Iran is hoping for, that this is a game of chicken, and they think the U.S. is going to swerve away first. Today's episode is brought to you by Ground News, which is something that I wish was around when I first started getting interested in and covering politics. I know it seems like common sense now, but it's really hard to sift through all the news that is out there because the same story can be completely different depending on who and where you're reading it from. That's where Ground News comes in. They give you all the versions of the story right in your feed, left, right, and center. They show you those side by side so you can see how the framing changes and you get a full view of the story. They also have a blind spot feed that flags stories that are being ignored by one side of the aisle entirely. In a media landscape built to keep you in an echo chamber, Ground News shows you the way out. And right now you can use the link in the description for 40% off. It is their best deal on their best plan. That's the Vantage plan right now. You can only get it from Make It Make Sense. Get access to their blind spot feed, more than 50,000 unique outlets for news, and one of my favorite features is their Burst Your Bubble newsletter, which helps you break out of that echo chamber and shows you your own media bias for all the things that you consume. I think it is an invaluable resource to expose you to different ideas and help keep your own media diet healthy, because a healthy media diet is just as important as a regular diet. Again, use the exclusive code in the description to get 40% off the Ground News Vantage plan, their absolute best plan right now. And that brings us to the peace talks between Iran and the U.S. And I want to say that I'm recording here at about 4 o'clock this afternoon, so by the time you see or hear this, things could very well have changed. But both CNN and Axios have reported since yesterday that Pakistani negotiators say a deal is close. We've heard this before, but the hope is that it's true. According to a one-page memo that Axios got its hands on, the U.S. has put a deal on the table for Iran to agree to not building nuclear weapons or enrich uranium, some reports say for as long as 20 years, but that part's unclear. In return, the U.S. would lift some economic sanctions and unfreeze billions of dollars in Iranian money and assets. Again, reports going back to last month have put that number as low as $6 billion worth or as high as $20 billion worth. Now, if this whole thing sounds kind of familiar to you, it's because it sounds almost identical to the main parts of the plan that Obama had in place in 2015 that Trump then tore up in 2018, even though it was working. Iranian stockpiles of enriched uranium plummeted after that deal, and international watchdogs were allowed to inspect Iranian nuclear sites. There's no indication that those kinds of inspections are part of the deal this time around being brokered by the Trump administration. But they could be, we just don't know. Money was also exchanged in the Obama deal too. $400 million in cash was flown to Iran. You've probably heard Trump talk about pallets of cash. That money was for unfrozen assets, and then later interest was paid on a frozen military deal from the 1970s that rose the entire amount that was paid to Iran to about $1.7 billion. That is still a far cry from $20 billion. It's still quite a bit less than $6 billion. But like I said, Trump has spent the last decade claiming Obama gave Iran money as a gift, not something that was negotiated here. So essentially what it looks like is the Trump administration is trying to make a more watered down, more expensive version of the same deal that we just could have had anyway for the last 8 years. But that's where things stand now. Peace talks, maybe not peace talks. The U.S. is still running a military operation by any other name without any clear authority on how, and if the end of the war is near, it might look a lot like the same thing we had a decade ago, except a little bit worse. On the show tomorrow, we are going to turn our focus to the Democrats, why the party is still lost, even 6 months out from the midterm elections. I sit down with former presidential campaign manager and Democratic strategist Maya Rupert to talk about the state of her party, why Democrats are still failing to reach voters, and what it means to be authentic in today's politics. You definitely don't want to miss that conversation. And be sure to rate and review the show wherever you get your podcasts, like and subscribe. Become a subscriber to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I just published a huge news story. After the Department of Justice brought, let's say, questionable charges against one of the nation's most prominent anti-hate watchdog groups 2 weeks ago, the Southern Poverty Law Center, I looked into just how many connections to extremism the Trump White House has. Honestly, it was more than I thought, and I was more shocked than I expected to be. The story is called The Company They Keep. It's a full breakdown of all the ties I found, ranging from the vice president to former top lawyers to DOJ settlements. It is up for free right now on the Substack. Links to that are in the description. Thank you so much for watching today. I'm Grant Hermes, and I'll talk to you next time.